So it's a great pleasure to welcome Anca Anton to the CIVIS Hub 1 seminar series on transdisciplinarity in education and research. This is the second seminar in this series, and Anca's very kindly agreed to talk with us about environmental communication. Um, I've met Anca before. I've met her at the Civis days, and I know she's a stunning presenter, and I know we're going to learn lots. So, and the purpose of these seminars is that we do want them to be um, reachable for everyone. So it is a transdisciplinary audience. And after we've had the seminar, we'll have a great big question and answer session, and I will turn off the recording before that happens, so everyone can turn their cameras on and have a great time. Anka, thank you so much for joining us at the transdisciplinary seminar series. I will turn my camera off now, and I'm right here in the background. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alistair. It is such a pleasure and a challenge to be here. As you mentioned, let's say I got in contact with what Hub One in Civis was doing, and with all the colleagues coming from different areas, different disciplines during our Salzburg Civis meeting, and it was, to be honest, quite an experience for me to be able to interact with so many different perspectives, in such a short amount of time. It was, let's say, a challenge similar to this one, which is talking about environmental communication in about 20 or 30 minutes. So it will be a little bit of, on one side, introductory aspect, introductory approach. I will try to go a little bit more in depth, depending on our audience. And full disclaimer from the beginning, my approach is usually, I would say, let's call it a civil society approach, an advocacy approach, an activist approach. I've been in an NGO, environmental NGO, for about 20 years. 16 out of those, I organized a community project, environmental community project. I will tell you a little bit during the presentation. So this topic is very near and dear to both my heart, my activity, both in academia and outside it. So let's talk a little bit about environmental communication, and just go, yeah, next. I don't know why my slide. Oh yeah, my slide is working now. So what exactly are we talking about? Because working in communication, you get all these different perspectives. So when Alistair first proposed this series, he proposed that I talk about environmental communication, but we need to be aware of the fact that there are different ways in which different people and different publics look at it, right? So, for example, for some, it's environmental communication, right? For others, it's sustainability communication. So, if you are coming more from organizational communication, or you are working in a company, or you are working more in the private sector, commercial private sector, then it's not so much environmental communication, but rather sustainability communication, right? So putting together the communication regarding environment, but in an organizational context, right? For others, like people in academia, a lot of the times is science communication, right? So how do we communicate about the sciences regarding the environment? So the perspective shifts, right? But we are all in the same in the same world, and we are all talking to, let's say, people outside organizations, outside academia. Most of the times, of course, we have some small stakeholders, or some groups of stakeholders that are in that are in organizations or are in academia. But most of the times, we are talking to people outside of these small groups. And for them, it's not so much environmental communication, it's not so much sustainability communication or science communication. It's simply communication. right? So I'm focusing more today on uh, communication with the general public. But of course, there are so many nuances to this. And one of the key takeaways for today is that this is not something that you approach as a block. There are so many nuances, and the more nuance you introduce, the more nuance it generates. And that is one of the challenges of communication today, the fragmentation of the publics, the fragmentation of perspectives, the fragmentation of approaches, the fragmentation of communication channels. So that old approach to communication, that we can communicate with everyone in kind of similar ways, has really lost relevance today in more ways than one. So basically, there is a core fallacy when we are talking about communication regarding not only the environment or any environmental issue. So working in communication, and I've worked in a public relations agency. I've worked in a public relations department in an organization. I've run a communication department in an NGO. I teach communication. So I've seen different perspectives on this. And a lot of the times what I hear is that communication is key. Now, from a professional perspective, that works well for me. But I always hear this: communication is key, or it's a communication crisis, right? Whenever there is a crisis, it's a lot of times a communication crisis. Or if we communicate this properly, then we will reach our goals. And a lot of the times, these are things that are not necessarily true, right? Communication is not this, universal solution to things, and we really need to look at communication, if it's a problem or if it's a solution. Because the reality of it is that if it's not a communication problem, then the solution is not only communication, right? So let's think about, I don't know, the recent pandemic. A lot of the times in some countries, right, um, people distrusted or had a lack of trust in the government, right? And I heard a lot that people would trust, vaccination campaigns or things like that if there was better communication around it. But you have to see that if there's a lack of trust, you need to solve the trust issue first and then communicate it. People do not trust, I don't know, the government or whatever organization because it communicates, or just because it communicates poorly, but because it acts poorly, right? So we need to identify whether or not it's a communication problem. Because a lot of the times when we are talking with climate crisis, whatever environmental issue, it's a lot of the times, the problem is a lot of the times that actions, are at the core of the problem rather than communicating them. So just trying to solve them by communication is not in itself a solution, right? This is at the core of greenwashing, right? You try to solve a problem in an organization or in a social context by communication, whereas the problem is not communication. So this is just something that I want to start with, because a lot of the times we throw onto communication some more systemic problems that we need to solve in society, like, I don't know, like education, like the relationship with government structures, like the way organizations or commercial organizations act, right? So I wish the problem was as simple as fixing communication. The reality is that it's a little bit more systemic, and of course, communication can solve or can help solve some of these issues, but only if at the core of the issue the problem is solved. Right. So Going more into, let's say, the communication aspects of this. First, when we start thinking about communication or environmental communication, is who are we talking with and what exactly do we want? Right. So my discussion today is going to be pretty much focused on publics and understanding publics. So basically, let's start with who are we talking with. And if you see, I'm not talking I'm not saying who are we talking to. If we start with who are we talking to, then we basically, from a communication perspective, we failed. Because the reality is that if we don't engage in dialogue, which kind of ensures us that we can test whether or not our messages were understood, and we get back the information that is processed by our audience, and we can act on that, then basically we've done nothing. So we need to engage in dialogue. We need to engage in what we call dialogic communication, in two-way communication, where we don't just use communication, let's say, as a bulletin board, but rather as building contexts to communicate with our publics. And I'm using publics, not public, because I don't think there is a public. There are only publics, right? So a plurality, an incredible plurality of publics. Right? And then what do we want? Do we want to inform? Do we want to change minds? Do we want to change behaviors? Depending on that, we are going to adapt our communication strategies. Depending on that, we are going to adapt our channels. And I wish it were only that simple, but the reality is that when we mix these two, our objectives and our publics, we will see that there is always another thing to take into consideration, which is the dynamic of the public, which can change the dynamic of our objectives. A lot of the times, when I saw the blueprint of communication campaigns, I saw objectives correlated with publics, which is great. This is how you should start. But I rarely see, let's say, plan Bs, right? What happens when there is a change in the public? Right? And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the dynamic, the different stages of the public. Right. So, first thing first, and this is what I'm going to lead with, communication is a personal thing. That is my dog, just so I make it very very personal. And for example, for me, he is a big part of how I communicate because he's a big part of my mental health. He helps me, have a very positive outlook on my day-to-day activity, right? So this is just a reminder and just a way to say that communication is a personal thing and should be treated as a personal thing, even if our audiences, if our publics are large. Because when we set up communication campaigns, we usually envision large amounts of people. But for each of these people that are in our audiences, our campaign is received as a one-to-one communication effort, right? So even if we build up communication campaigns aimed at a lot of people, we need to take into consideration that they will not perceive it as a multi-person campaign. They will see it as a personal thing, and how and when and in which way they will receive that information and engage with that communication will be a personal thing for them. That is, I think, one of the biggest challenges in communication, and because environmental communication is becoming such a big part of our lives, it will be, or it already is. In terms of environmental communication, we hear a lot about eco-anxiety, which is which is I would say one of the biggest things that will start coming up, moving forward. The fire in LA basically showed how much of a personal thing environmental change and environmental impact is. So any communication campaign needs to try at least to reach that level of personal engagement. Right. So just to nuance what I mean by communication is a personal thing. So people care about what is close to them, right? So people in the general audience, people in media, people overall care about what is close to them. They care about the disasters that are close to them. They care about the wars that are close to them. So, for example, we've had, so right now I'm based in Romania. Romania has a border with Ukraine, right? There are several countries that have a border with Ukraine. When we look at media who is doing issue framing, who is doing agenda setting, right? They look and they report differently on the war that is close to them compared to, for example, the war in Gaza and the whole Middle East conflict. Why? Because it is close to them and because their audiences, the people in those countries, are close to that conflict. So people care about what is close to them. Talking in terms of environmental communication about the issues that are close to each set of people, to each group of people, will make communication personal and will make the audience more receptive to that issue. Another aspect is people care about what impacts them directly. Right? So I mentioned the LA fires, right? If you talk about climate change, about different types of losses related to that disaster, while it is it is a disaster what happened, it will be more relevant to the people who are in the United States or who are closer to California than to someone who is dealing with their own fires, their own environmental issues, who is, for example, dealing with floods, right? So personalizing communication is something at the core, I think, of environmental communication. Another thing is a third thing about making communication personal is people care when you are authentic. When you talk about the things that you know, when you talk about the things that you experienced, and when you talk about it in a personal way. Right. So, for example, this is the reason why the people engaged in communication campaigns need to be authentic and engage in an authentic way, talk about the things that they experienced. Right. So, for example, I'm just going to give you an example a little bit later about how I engaged in such a campaign with the audience that I targeted, right? So, of course, this making it personal does depend on the challenges that we face in environmental communication, right? So one of the core challenges is the complexity of environmental issues. And here, one aspect that is very relevant to communication is how do you balance the sunshine and the rainy perspective, right? And the reality is that sometimes while you do need to bring some balance, you need to identify which audiences react better to the sunshine perspective or to the rainy perspective, or which perspective you need to use related to different types of publics. if these sunshine and rainy perspectives are not familiar to any person in the audience, right? So this is the positive or the negative outlook, doomsday approach to environmental change is the rainy perspective. The sunshine perspective is the positive perspective, which is that these are just transformations that we go through, and we need to also look at the positive impact that job creation, for example, generates in society. So it's bringing more of a maybe corporate organizational perspective on it, but different audiences will react to different perspectives. Right? Misinformation and disinformation again are a major issue, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. Audience diversity again, and tailoring messages to different audiences is again a challenge. And increasingly, as I mentioned, eco-anxiety will be one of the emerging issues, right? So not just informing people, not just, changing attitudes, but let's say calming people and trying to have a constructive attitude will be one of the challenges. Right. So moving from challenges to strategies for effective communication. So what are the few things, or what are some of the things that we can do in order to move forward in an effective way from a communication perspective, from an environmental perspective, right? So one thing is, of course, in communication, we deal a lot with messages, with audiences, right? So one is framing messages for impact, right? So not just framing them to convey the message, to convey some information, but actually taking into consideration the impact and the relevance for the audience. And for example, we can use relatable stories. This is at the core of it, visuals to enhance understanding. Right. Another another aspect that kind of relates to framing messages for impact is emphasizing solutions rather than problems. Right. This can inspire action, might not, of course, but it's also a way to address eco-anxiety. Right. Focus on the solution, not the problem. Maybe even focusing on how audiences can engage with the solution. Right? So not just communicate the problem, but also offering a solution. Right? I do think that we need to communicate the problems to make people aware or understand exactly what they are dealing with, but the focus should be on the solutions, right? So this is about the messages. Another aspect that we need to take into consideration is transdisciplinary collaboration. And I think that Hub One is doing a very good thing related to this. So combining insights from social sciences, from environmental sciences, from communication studies. It's not, just about communicating things. It's about what, let's say, attitudes we generate, what behaviors we generate. And there's a major issue that we have right now in communication related to action, related to behavior. The thing is that as communication has moved so much online, action has moved a lot online. And it's very difficult to get people to act offline when we communicate with them only online. So this is one of the core issues that we have right now. How do we generate offline behavior through online communication? It's getting increasingly problematic, but bringing this diversity of perspectives is an incredible way to contextualize communication, right? Making it more palpable, making it more nuanced, and maybe through one of these perspectives, reaching members of the audience because different people react to different things, right? So this would actually be one of the core recommendations. It was certainly a very interesting experience for me in Salzburg when I discovered more about this transdisciplinary collaboration and about the different perspectives of my colleagues. Countering misinformation. So I mentioned it before as a challenge. So there are a few things that we can do. So of course, first thing is to differentiate between misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. UNESCO has a very interesting manual on fake news and information disorder, which differentiates between these three. Misinformation is, what the general public does when it just shares or just conveys information without checking it, thinking that it is um, um, true. Disinformation is actually intentional with the objective of generating, let's say, misinformation on the long run. And malinformation is basically the same process, but with the intent to harm. Right. So I'm just focusing right now on misinformation, although some of these strategies can be used for disinformation and malinformation too. So pre-bunking misinformation. This would mean understanding the dynamic of messages of the messages that and the information that the public is processing and consuming and communicating in advance, right? So for example, I saw this used not in environmental communication but rather in election communication and political communication, when the Republic of Moldova found out about a misinformation campaign, or a disinformation campaign actually, that Russia was going to put forward, and they communicated in the public sphere that this was going to happen, that the information that they were going to communicate was not true, and this is the truth, right? So this is a pre-bunking effort. In environmental communication, we can also do this, either related to transformation in the environment or in relation to the public being at different stages in its development and being at the age where they find out about environmental issues. If we can manage to pre-bunk some of the information that they are going to get in contact with, then it's, let's say, a win. Right. Then, of course, using storytelling, making it understandable, making it relatable, engaging publics in a transparent and dialogue-based approach. And one of the most important things, I think, tailoring messages to specific audiences, right? So a lot of the times campaigns set the public, set the objective, set the message, and then they run with it. But the reality is that a lot of the times we need to nuance this a lot more. I'm going to go a little bit faster. So another strategy is engaging with social media, making the most of it. But as I mentioned, this is going to be increasingly problematic because people that only, let's say, engage in social media tend to be less engaged in offline environments. Then I think this is at the core of, let's say, actionable recommendations, creating offline contexts for engagement, right? So organizing events and campaigns that create communities and thinking this in a long-term engagement perspective. So let me just give you the example of something that I did. So for 16 years, I organized weekend, and not only weekend, activities for volunteers in the botanical garden in Bucharest. So during spring and during autumn, each weekend we got 20, 30, 40, 50 volunteers each day. And they were coming and we were just, cleaning spaces, whatever needed to be done. Over the 60 years, we created a large community of thousands of people who came. Some of them got married because they met here. Some of them came with their kids when some years passed. But basically, we got people interested in a topic, interested in doing something, but that had no outlets to do this. So creating outlets is, I think, at the core of environmental communication. And what we did is we created a space where people could engage, could interact, could mobilize, could organize their own environmental activities. There were some spin-offs regarding related to this project. We also had part of this project, let's say, a treasure hunt that was tailored to environmental topics. And this is something that I started. This is me just organizing things. I started when I was a student in my second or third year, but I continued it up until now when I teach, because this was something that made sense for the community. And what we did, of course, I didn't do it alone. I did it with a lot of people, but we built a community. Right, so community building, I think, is one of the best way to communicate, because you do it in an authentic way. Right, so just a few things related to focusing on understanding the publics. Alistair, I'm over the 30 minutes mark, but I hope I can get a few more minutes just to
Anca,
finish.
don't
Yeah,
worry. Take your
yeah.
time. There's no stress.
Okay, okay. Because the more I did this presentation, the more excited I got. So there are a few more things. So just to focus on understanding the publics. So, oh, yeah. So basically, one thing to take into consideration, that the public is not a monolith, right? It is fragmented, it is dynamic, and it is fluid. So it changes, it can change from one stage to the other. It can go back to a previous stage. So a lot of the times when we build up communication campaign, we think about an active public, right? But the thing is that a lot of the times in environmental communication, the challenge is making the public aware or making the public care, right? So I think that we need to diversify environmental communication in order to address different stages of the public related to different issues. Right, an aware public can be a latent for an issue, can be a latent public for another issue, right? An apathetic public regarding an issue can be an aware or an active public for another issue, right? So this non-monolithical approach is, I think, something that we need to incorporate more in environmental communication. Also, yeah, here the source. Another thing to take into consideration is what categories of publics we are targeting. The broader the campaign or the communication program, the more problematic it is to actually engage in authentic communication, because you need to do more things, you need to communicate more messages. Here you have a model that comes from more commercial settings, but we do recognize, the types of publics that we have in all kinds of organization related to environmental communication, whether we are an NGO, whether we are a company, whether we are a university, for example. We can recognize them. And what I did was try to adapt a little bit, and I brought you a classification, just one classification of different stakeholders, different publics that we have in environmental communication, their characteristics, their communication challenges, or the communication challenges that we have related to this specific category, and what strategies we can use from a communication perspective to address this particular category, so each particular category, right? So we have science deniers, which we know a lot of the times these are people who is very difficult to talk with because they refuse dialogue. In some cases, to be honest, I think that we can also consider them, sorry, kind of a lost public, because if they repeatedly refuse dialogue, it's difficult to communicate with someone who refuses dialogue, which is why going in as early as possible in talking to students, in talking to pupils, regarding science is, I think, at the core of environmental communication, environmental education, actually. Right? So from what research we have now, it seems that pre-bunking works best in this case. But there will always be something with this particular category. Then we have adaptation skeptics, right? So this is an aware public, but it's not an active public, right? So they accept climate change, but they are not necessarily convinced about the need to do something. They sometimes say that this is something that happens in the history of the Earth, so we don't need to do something about it. Here, I think that this personal connection to environmental issues, so local impacts, what I mentioned before about making it personal, the fact that people care about what is close to them geographically, what impacts them directly, right? So these familiar practical terms work best for this category. Then another category that we have are whitewashers. These adopt a more, let's say, commercial approach to it, right? So they focus on the positive narratives, green jobs, innovation, on the positive impact of technology rather than trying to see it in a balanced perspective. They don't necessarily engage in discussing the rainy side, right? They either don't recognize or reject this systemic impact of technology, right? So this is in this case, communication kind of needs first to identify why exactly they adopt this sunshine perspective. It might be just an ethical thing, or it really does depend, but the challenge here is to push them towards a balanced discussion about the sunshine and the rainy side of technology and its impact, and exactly what the environment is like, or the impact of technology on the environment, sorry. Right. So this is just one thing here. This is not about telling them they are not right. This is about appealing to them engaging in an approach that is balanced and trying to use their personal experience in order to bring in this balance. Right. Oh, you will see this approach even unintentionally. So some people will do it intentionally, but some people will do it unintentionally, right? So for example, if they work in renewable energy sectors, or if they work for a company that is doing green energy or something like that, they will tend to overemphasize the positive side and diminish the rainy part, or even take the discussion or understand the discussion about the rainy side as an accusation towards them. So this is just about transparency, making it personal, trying to bring in some balance in the discussion. And then the fourth category, and you have here, the source. I do recommend this article, is the world saviors. Right, so these are the people that strongly believe in the urgency of actions. Sometimes they are idealistic and critical, so they can go towards a more extreme approach. Um, and they do engage in a lot of emotional communication, which does not really work well with some of the other categories, and a lot of the times it pushes people away rather than bringing them on board, right? So this is about balancing emotional and rational communication, and trying to focus on empathy and not guilt as an action driver, right? Trying to bring them together in a position where they can engage in dialogue, in actionable dialogue with other categories. These are incredible ambassadors in any environmental communication campaign if they manage to not guilt people into doing things, right? Right. So these are, let's say, four categories. Now, how to communicate with them, now that's another thing, and of course it's for another time. One thing to take into consideration is that because they are so diversified, they need a diversified approach in terms of objectives, in terms of messaging, in terms of tactics, how we call them tactics in communication. So actions that we take to engage them, and in terms of channels, right? Um, you need to take into consideration the increase in credibility that social media channels have, that social media driven journalism, sometimes you can call it journalism, other times not, has. Traditional media is really in a problematic situation. They have less engagement than some YouTube channels at this point. So this is something to take into consideration, the dynamic of the information environment, right? So I don't have time to go into it, but the PESA model is a very good way to approach it, right? So it's the type of media that we engage with, right? So this is, I think, my last slide. So what exactly are our roles? I am particularly focused on academics and students in this case. So basically, we have these dual roles: academics as knowledge brokers and students as change agents. However, we also need to take into consideration that students can be knowledge brokers and academics can be change agents. So this is about a lot of the times working together because, for example, for Gen Z, students are a more legitimate voice to talk about it, to talk about environmental communication, environmental impact of human actions. But academics can be moderators for this knowledge input, but also they need to engage in, let's say, building communities, building dialogue, building contexts. I'm saying this also from a personal perspective. It really helped me to explain and present to my students environmental issues, sustainability communication when I was, on the ground working and organizing communities. It gave me the insights that I needed in order to make communication authentic. And this is basically at the core of it, right? So not limiting ourselves to one role, not building, let's say, just monolith approaches, but rather interacting in any way possible. Right. So, thank you very much. I think that's my presentation for today. I went a lot overboard. Sorry about over the time allocated. Sorry about that.
It was stunning presentation, Anka. We've all really, really enjoyed listening, and we have a very flexible schedule, so there's nothing to be worried about there. Thank you so much for sharing so much
My
insight with
pleasure.
us in such a short time.